Try to imagine a morning in Rome in the year 67 AD. At that time, the city stood at the center of the civilized world, a place where power, luxury, and violence coexisted in a fragile balance. Stone-paved streets echoed with the footsteps of soldiers, officials, and ordinary citizens. Within that space, amid a crowded public square, Emperor Nero appeared, wearing the outward bearing of the ruler of the most powerful empire of his age. Beside him stood a young, beautiful woman, dressed in the elaborate garments expected of a Roman empress. Jewels shimmered across her robes, and the curious yet reverent gazes of the crowd converged upon the pair. To an outside observer, the scene might have seemed familiar enough: an emperor and his new wife, a living symbol of authority, wealth, and imperial order. But step a little closer, or listen carefully to the whispers spreading through the crowd, and the image quickly turns cold and unsettling. For everyone knew a truth no one dared to say aloud. The woman walking at Nero's side, the one addressed with the title of Empress, had once been a boy. His name was Sporus. That single detail warps what first appeared to be a dignified spectacle, not because it violated the social norms of ancient Rome, which were already no stranger to extremes, but because the story behind it reveals something far more deeply distorted. This was not merely a palace scandal, nor just another example of the moral decay of the ruling elite. It was a sign of a human tragedy unfolding at the very heart of absolute power. The story of Nero and Sporus forces uncomfortable questions upon us. What happens when a person holds limitless authority, unchecked, unchallenged, unrestrained? When the boundaries between personal desire and political power, between affection and possession, between grief and obsession, completely dissolve. In Nero's case, these questions were not abstract. They were answered through the fate of a real human being, in flesh and blood, in a life twisted beyond recognition. From the outside, it is easy to dismiss this story as a symptom of madness, of the decadent excess often used to characterize Roman emperors during the empire's decline. But stopping there means missing the true nature of the problem. The most terrifying aspect lies not in the strangeness of the behavior itself, but in the process by which one person is turned into a tool for another's obsessions. Sporus did not enter history as a figure of power or as an agent of great events. He appears instead as a shadow, a substitute, a vessel for what Nero had lost and could not accept losing. In this story, Sporus is not seen as an individual with his own will, memories, or desires, but as an image meant to fill a void in the emperor's mind. For that reason, this is not merely a story about ancient Rome, nor simply a dark chapter in Nero's biography. It is a clear demonstration of how absolute power can deform human emotion, how it can turn love into possession, grief into obsession, and ultimately transform a living person into someone no longer permitted to be themselves. To understand how such a tragedy could occur, we must return to the moment Nero first ascended the throne. Few remember that, in his youth, Nero was once regarded as a source of hope. He became emperor at just 16 years old, an age at which many have barely begun to understand the world around them. In the early years of his reign, Nero did not resemble a tyrant. On the contrary, he appeared as a young ruler willing to listen and seemingly attentive to the needs of the people. Nero reduced certain heavy taxes, easing the burden on the lower classes long accustomed to exploitation by the imperial system. He spent lavishly on public entertainment, built theaters, and organized grand festivals that brought a sense of prosperity and joy to Rome. Unlike many emperors before him, Nero did not remain hidden within palace walls. He appeared in public, interacted with ordinary citizens, and even participated in artistic performances, acts that irritated the aristocracy but delighted the masses. To many Romans of the time, Nero represented a new generation, a young emperor, approachable, flexible, and seemingly willing to break away from rigid traditions. This image made it easy to forget a crucial truth. The power Nero held was nearly absolute. There was no truly effective mechanism to restrain or limit the authority of an emperor. And when power exists without boundaries, it quietly begins to erode the person who possesses it. As his reign continued, Nero became increasingly isolated. He lived within a court where every word was carefully measured, where honesty could become a death sentence. Praise multiplied, while dissent disappeared. Nero no longer heard opposing views, not because he was always right, but because no one dared to suggest he might be wrong. That prolonged silence gradually distorted his perception of reality. Alongside this grew a fear of betrayal. In a vast empire where power equaled survival, Nero understood that many coveted his position. Every glance, every whisper could be interpreted as a conspiracy. Over time, the necessary vigilance of a ruler hardened into extreme suspicion. Nero trusted no one fully, not even those closest to him. Within such an environment, the line between personal emotion and political authority began to dissolve. Nero was not only emperor, he was the sole arbiter of right and wrong. With no one powerful enough to restrain him, his emotions became law. Anger could lead to a person's death. Insecurity could turn into violence. Personal pain could be answered with destructive commands. Ancient historians record that by the middle of his reign, Nero showed clear signs of paranoia. He was quick to anger, erratic in behavior, alternately displaying excessive generosity and chilling cruelty. Major decisions were no longer guided by reason or the common good, but heavily shaped by fleeting emotions. Nero could no longer distinguish between personal desire and imperial responsibility. From someone once expected to usher Rome into a new golden age, Nero gradually became the center of fear and unease. This moral decay did not occur overnight. It was the result of many years spent wielding absolute power, unchallenged, unrestricted, and never allowed to be wrong. From this point onward, the path toward irreversible tragedy began to take shape, quietly but steadily, within the mind of the young emperor he once had been. It was precisely during this period, as Nero slid deeper into isolation and paranoia, that Poppaea Sabina entered his life. Her arrival marked more than the beginning of a new romantic relationship. It became a crucial turning point that exposed the fractures already forming in the emperor's psyche. Poppaea was unlike any woman Nero had known before, and it was likely this very difference that made it impossible for him to maintain the distance he needed. Ancient sources consistently describe Poppaea as a woman of striking beauty, but her appeal went far beyond physical appearance. She was intelligent, perceptive, and deeply aware of how power functioned within the Roman court. Poppaea knew how to listen, how to observe, and, most importantly, when to remain silent and when to speak. In a world where many women were treated as political instruments, she demonstrated a clear sense of agency and an understanding of her own position. When Nero met Poppaea, he was already married. Octavia, the daughter of the previous emperor, was bound to Nero through a marriage that was entirely political. Calm, reserved, and nearly invisible in public life, Octavia neither sought influence nor competed for attention. Yet it was precisely this quiet presence that, in Nero's eyes, gradually became an emptiness. Poppaea, by contrast, embodied everything Octavia was not. She was confident, alluring, fully aware of being watched, and she did not shy away from that gaze. The relationship between Nero and Poppaea began like many notorious affairs among Rome's elite, an act of infidelity shielded by privilege and enforced silence. But it quickly surpassed the boundaries of an ordinary affair. Nero was not merely attracted to Poppaea, he became consumed by her. What began as desire soon hardened into possession, and then into obsession. Nero could not tolerate the idea that Poppaea might exist beyond his control. His jealousy no longer resembled a personal emotion. It became an expression of power. Nero began to monitor Poppaea's movements closely, placing guards around her under the pretense of protection. Whenever she appeared in public, his eyes followed her relentlessly, ready to erupt if anyone seemed overly attentive. Lavish gifts were bestowed not only as tokens of affection, but as bindings, constant reminders that everything Poppaea possessed came from him. Nor did Nero stop there. He began reshaping reality itself to legitimize his obsession. He divorced Octavia, a decision that shocked Rome and alienated much of the aristocracy. A political marriage once considered vital to the stability of the regime was cast aside to make room for Poppaea. Nero staged an extravagant imperial wedding, publicly displaying his favor and declaring that his choice was beyond question. Yet even as empress, Poppaea was far from free. Her new status only deepened her isolation. Nero gradually severed her ties to family, friends, and former allies, replacing them with a circle of servants and courtiers loyal only to him. Poppaea lived amid luxury, but it was a gilded cage, a world constructed so that every movement remained within Nero's sight. In this relationship, love ceased to be mutual and became total possession. Nero did not love Poppaea as an independent person, but as an extension of himself, a reflection of his deepest desires and insecurities. And within this distortion, the seeds of tragedy began to gather, quietly yet inevitably. Still, Poppaea was not entirely passive within this suffocating bond. She understood that she was living beside a man of immense power and profound instability, and she also knew that absolute silence was not always a form of self-preservation. Unlike many others at court, Poppaea retained the courage to speak, to argue, even while fully aware of the danger. Perhaps the intelligence and confidence that had carried her to the position of empress now placed her in her most vulnerable position. In the year 65 AD, when tragedy struck, Poppaea was pregnant. It should have been a time of special care and protection, not only out of affection, but because the child she carried could have been the future heir of the empire. Yet the atmosphere within the palace was anything but calm. Nero had grown increasingly volatile, easily angered, quick to feel insulted by even mild criticism. Poppaea, in the emotional sensitivity of pregnancy, seemed no longer able to endure his impulsive outbursts in silence. Ancient sources do not fully agree on the immediate cause of the fatal argument. Some claim Poppaea reproached Nero for spending too much time at chariot races and theatrical performances, neglecting his family. Others suggest she criticized him for placing his personal image above his responsibilities as husband and emperor. Whatever the precise cause, all accounts converge on one point. It was a fierce confrontation, where words were no longer restrained and emotions completely overwhelmed control. In his rage, Nero struck. It may have been a blow, it may have been a kick, delivered to the pregnant woman standing before him. The act occurred in an instant, but its consequences were irreversible. Poppaea collapsed, suffering severe internal injuries. There was no prolonged violence, no premeditated plan, only a moment in which power, fury, and loss of control fused into raw brutality. Almost immediately afterward, reality seemed to crash down upon Nero with merciless force. As he watched Poppaea in agony, slipping into critical condition, his rage dissolved into panic. The emperor, who had ordered executions without hesitation, now found himself utterly helpless. Nero begged, pleaded, even commanded Poppaea to live, as though his authority could coerce fate itself. He summoned the finest physicians in Rome, promising rich rewards while threatening severe punishment if they failed to save her. But ancient medicine had limits it could not overcome. Poppaea's injuries were too severe, and the child she carried could not survive. Within a matter of hours, the woman who had been the focus of Nero's obsession breathed her last. Poppaea's death did not merely take away an empress. It also claimed the life of an unborn child, once expected to continue the imperial bloodline. For Nero, this was a total collapse. He had spent his entire reign controlling, possessing, and reshaping everything according to his will, yet in that moment he could alter nothing. Power, wealth, status, all became meaningless before a motionless body. Those who were present later recalled that Nero knelt beside Poppaea, at times apologizing, at times issuing commands, his voice breaking between desperation and denial. This was no longer the image of an emperor, but of a man realizing that with his own hands he had destroyed the one thing he believed he truly loved. From that moment on, pain without an outlet began to warp and fester, quietly, but violently, laying the groundwork for even more extreme actions to come. After Poppaea's death, the Roman court entered a strange and oppressive phase, one in which the emperor's personal grief slowly transformed into a distorted form of power imposed upon everyone around him. For Nero, this loss was not simply the death of a wife. It was the complete collapse of a reality he himself had constructed, and he refused to accept it. From the very beginning of the funeral rites, Nero made clear that he could not let go. According to Roman custom, the dead were cremated, their ashes preserved as a way of closing the cycle of life. Nero forbade this. He ordered Papia's body to be embalmed, preserved as though death were only a pause rather than an ending. Her body was placed in a lavish mausoleum, more extravagant than those of many emperors before her. Every detail was meticulously arranged, not to say farewell, but to hold on. Nero's grief quickly crossed the boundary of ordinary mourning and turned into a form of obsessive veneration. He declared Poppaea a goddess, establishing official rites of worship and forcing the court and the people to acknowledge the divine status of a dead woman. Temples were built, prayers composed, as if by elevating Poppaea beyond death, Nero could place her in a realm where he could still reach her. Within the palace, his paranoia grew increasingly visible. Nero spoke to Poppaea as though she were still alive, still able to hear and respond. He spent hours beside her body, speaking aloud, reminiscing, sometimes reproaching her, sometimes begging. To Nero, Poppaea had never truly left. She had merely shifted into another state, one over which he retained complete authority. In his mind, death was not the final boundary. The court was forced to adapt to this delusion. Poppaea's seat remained empty at banquets, yet no one was permitted to refer to it as the place of the deceased. Officials had to speak of her in the present tense, to behave as though the empress were still present somewhere in the room. Any slip of the tongue, even accidental, could exact a heavy price. Truth no longer mattered. The only imperative was to sustain the emperor's illusion. Fear spread throughout the court. No one dared urge Nero to face reality, for any appeal to reason was taken as an insult, even an act of betrayal. Those who suggested that he move forward, that he concern himself with the fate of the empire rather than sink into mourning, were gradually dismissed, exiled, or disappeared from court altogether. Silence became the only means of survival. At this point, Nero was no longer merely a man grieving the loss of his wife. He had become the center of a fabricated world, one in which power allowed him to rewrite reality at will. Love, already twisted into possession while Poppaea lived, now further transformed into a desperate attempt to deny death itself. The greater the pain, the tighter Nero's grip became, not only on Poppaea's memory, but on everyone around him. This psychological collapse did not unfold in screams or obvious madness. It was slow, prolonged, concealed beneath layers of ritual, authority, and enforced obedience. And within this suffocating space, where death was denied and people were compelled to play roles within another man's fantasy, a new tragedy was quietly taking shape, waiting to emerge in a form even more terrifying. It was during this bleak period, when the court was forced to coexist with an emperor who refused to acknowledge reality, that Sporus entered Nero's field of vision, not through any deliberate action of his own, nor through talent or ambition. Sporus's appearance in this story was entirely accidental, but its consequences were fated. Sporus was born a slave and raised within the Roman imperial household. Later, while still very young, he was freed, becoming a freedman, legally free, yet entirely dependent on the emperor's favor. It was a status that placed one close to power and yet terrifyingly vulnerable. People like Sporus were educated, trained to serve the administrative machinery of the empire, living far better than ordinary citizens. In return, they had no real protection. Their lives could be altered or ended by a single glance or fleeting thought from the ruler. Until that moment, Sporus was merely an anonymous youth among hundreds of servants and attendants in the palace. He was noted for his delicate appearance, soft features not yet hardened by adulthood, and that alone became the reason his life would veer onto a path from which there was no return. Several ancient sources record a chilling detail. Sporus bore a striking resemblance to Poppaea Sabina, especially in his eyes and facial structure. In a world that believed outward form reflected inner essence, this resemblance was more than coincidence. To Nero, now deeply immersed in grief and delusion, it appeared as a sign, a whisper of fate. When Nero looked at Sporus, he did not see an individual human being. He saw a possibility, an opportunity to undo the irreversible, to draw Poppaea back from death. In the mind of a man accustomed to imposing his will upon the world, death no longer seemed an absolute boundary. If Poppaea could be deified, if her body could be preserved, then rebirthing her in another form appeared to be the next logical step. In Nero's thinking, Sporus's gender was not a serious problem. It was merely a technical detail, a minor obstacle that could be overcome through power and command. Nero had lived for too long in a reality where every boundary could be bent. Law, custom, morality, all had repeatedly been forced to yield to his will. So why, then, should the body of a young man not be shaped in the same way? What makes this all the more terrifying is that the process did not unfold in a sudden burst of madness, but within a cold and distorted logic. Nero did not act like a raving lunatic. He acted like someone who believed he had found a solution to his pain. In his own mind, Sporus was not being destroyed. He was being elevated, granted a noble role, allowed to become the woman Nero loved above all else. And what of Sporus? There is no record suggesting that he was ever asked for his consent, nor was there any need to ask. Within the power structure of the Roman Empire, a young freedman had no right to refuse the emperor. The choice had been made the moment Nero saw that face and decided to assign it a different meaning. From that instant onward, Sporus ceased to exist as an individual and became a vessel for the memories, obsessions, and unresolved grief of a man who held absolute power. From there, everything slipped into a darker territory, where power no longer stopped at seizing another's will, but began to intrude brutally upon the human body itself. Nero's decision did not end with merely seeing Poppaea and Sporus. He wanted to make that resemblance permanent, undeniable, irreversible. And the method he chose was among the most cruel acts power can produce: forced surgery. Roman historians record that Sporus was compelled to undergo a procedure intended to permanently feminize his body. This was not a medical intervention meant to heal, but an act of violence cloaked in imperial authority. In the context of ancient medicine, such operations were extraordinarily dangerous. There was no true anesthesia, no sterile conditions, an extremely high risk of death, prolonged suffering, and almost certain lasting damage. None of this, however, concerned the man who gave the order. Nero's objective was unmistakable. He wanted to erase every trace of maleness from Sporus's body forever. This was not merely about altering appearance, but about eliminating reproductive capacity, erasing a future, erasing any possibility of returning to who he once was. From that moment on, Sporus's body no longer belonged to him. It became a project, an object to be modified in service of another man's obsession. The deepest wound was not only physical, but the systematic destruction of personal identity. In Roman society, manhood was closely tied to citizenship, honor, and social standing. To be stripped of male identity was to be pushed outside every familiar framework. Sporus was no longer regarded as a man, yet he was not acknowledged as a woman in any natural sense either. He was placed into a void, a space where there was no proper name for what he had become. After the surgery, Sporus permanently lost the ability to reproduce. A portion of his future was cut away along with his body. At the same time, a new role was imposed upon him. Nero did not want to change form alone. He wanted to change identity itself. Sporus was forced to abandon the name he had carried since birth, the name tied to memory, to the past, to his true self. In its place, Nero gave him a new name, Sabina. It was not chosen at random, but carefully selected to echo Poppaea Sabina. From that point forward, the substitution ceased to be symbolic. It became official. Sporus, as an individual, was erased. Sabina, a reconstruction drawn from Nero's memory, was brought into existence. This renaming was not merely a formality. It was a declaration of ownership. When a person is stripped of the right to name themselves, they are also stripped of the right to tell their own story. Sabina was not allowed to exist as an independent human being, but as a shadow, a distorted imitation of the dead. Everything, from clothing and gestures to public appearances before the court, had to serve the image Nero wished to see. In the emperor's eyes, this was not a crime. It was a solution, a way to patch over loss with power and violence. But from Sporus's perspective, or rather, from the perspective of the person who once bore that name, this was the moment a human life was turned into an object, a living body treated as raw material, an identity regarded as something detachable, replaceable, and moldable at another's whim. From here on, the story ceased to be merely the tragedy of a mad emperor and became chilling testimony to what happens when absolute power meets a human being with no means of defense. Once the body had been altered in ways that could never be undone, the next phase unfolded more slowly, but no less cruelly. Nero was not in a hurry. He wanted his creation perfected layer by layer, detail by detail, as if he were reconstructing Poppaea from memory. And Sporus, now called Sabina, became the center of that process. Appearance was the first layer to be fully controlled. Sabina was dressed in the very garments once worn by Empress Poppaea, not replicas, but the original dresses, still bearing the presence of the woman who had died. The jewelry was the same: necklaces, rings, hairpins, all items Poppaea had worn in life. Each object was not merely an adornment, but a silent reminder of who Sabina was expected to become. Makeup and hairstyling became daily rituals, carried out with care and strict precision. The hairstyle had to match Poppaea's. The application of powder and color had to align with the image Nero remembered. There was no room for chance or individuality. Each morning was another adjustment, another effort to push Sabina's face closer to the image of the dead woman fixed in the emperor's mind. But appearance was only the surface. What Nero truly fixated on was behavior and gesture. Sabina was taught how to walk with softness, how to sit with composure, how to move her hands, turn her head, even how to remain silent. Small gestures, normally unconscious expressions of self, were now scrutinized and corrected. At times, a single step that was not similar enough could provoke Nero's rage. Even the voice was not allowed to remain unchanged. Sabina was forced to alter the way she spoke, lowering the pitch, softening the cadence. It was not simply a matter of speaking more quietly, but of speaking differently. Speaking as Poppaea once did, or at least as Nero remembered her speaking. Each time Sabina opened her mouth, she had to consider not what she wanted to say, but what others expected to hear from the image of Poppaea reborn. That control did not happen over the course of a single day or even a single month. It stretched on, repeating itself until it became the rhythm of everyday life. And it was precisely that regularity that wore a person down the fastest. Sabina was not beaten every day, nor did she live constantly in physical pain. Yet each passing day erased a small part of who she was. Psychologically, this was the most brutal aspect of all. Sabina was forced to see herself through someone else's eyes. The mirror no longer reflected a real person, but Nero's expectations. Every dress she put on, every gesture that was corrected, carried the same message: the person you once were no longer has value. The only thing worthy of existing is the image I wish to see. There was no private space for grief, no right to name what had been lost. Sabina was not allowed to mourn Sporus, because Sporus, officially, no longer existed. To keep living from one day to the next meant continuing to play someone else, inside a story that was never her own. And so the process of recreation went on, not through miracles or religious faith, but through the merciless repetition of control and coercion. Each day marked another step away from the true self, another layer of memory buried, another fragment of identity worn down. Sabina still breathed, still walked through the palace halls, but that existence grew increasingly faint, like a shadow sustained by another person's memories and obsessions. Then, when Nero deemed the recreation complete, the story moved into a chapter that even those living within the Roman court could not easily ignore. In the year 67 AD, Nero decided to hold an official wedding, not in secrecy or quiet discretion, but a ceremony prepared with great care, fully equipped with imperial rites, as though it were the most legitimate and momentous event of the empire. Every detail was meticulously arranged. The ritual followed the established model for an emperor and empress. From the garments to the music to the traditional formalities, nothing was omitted. Sabina appeared dressed as an empress, bearing symbols of power that only Poppaea had once been allowed to wear. Nero stood beside her as the groom, under the gaze of the entire court. Officials, nobles, and invited guests were all present, and their presence was not optional. They were instructed to attend, directed to offer congratulations, required to appear joyful before an event everyone understood was deeply abnormal. In that atmosphere, silence became the only way to survive. No one publicly questioned what they were witnessing. No one voiced doubt. All participated in a collective performance, where everyone knew they were playing a role, yet no one dared step off the stage. The true nature of the ceremony was impossible to conceal for anyone willing to face reality. This was not merely a controversial marriage. It was an emperor marrying a young person who had undergone forced surgery, someone stripped of identity and compelled to live under another name. Yet that truth was covered by layers of ritual, power, and elegant language. When everything was labeled with proper titles, the crime itself seemed to gain legitimacy. At the moment of the vows, Sabina was not seen as a human being with her own will, but as the returned embodiment of Poppaea. The crowd did not bless an individual, but Nero's satisfaction, the illusion that death could be undone if power were great enough. Cheers rang out, but beneath them lay fear, helplessness, and a quiet shame shared by those forced to take part. After that wedding, Sabina's position within the court was formally established. In name, Sporus had become empress. It was the highest title imaginable, and yet completely hollow. Sabina had honors, ceremonial protection, attendants who followed her everywhere, but no autonomy, no real voice. Everything existed solely to sustain the image Nero wished to preserve. What was most terrifying was that from that point onward, madness no longer resided in isolated acts, but was acknowledged and operated by the entire apparatus of power. When such a wedding could take place openly, be recorded, be celebrated, the boundary between reality and delusion had been completely erased. The palace continued to function, the court continued to convene, but at its center stood an empress created through violence and an emperor living fully inside a world of his own making. After the wedding, Sabina's life entered a different phase, quieter, yet more tense than ever. Officially, she was now the Empress of Rome. In reality, it was a role without an end curtain, an identity that existed only so long as it was performed exactly as the ruler of the empire desired. The greatest and heaviest duty imposed on Sabina was to always be Poppaea, not only on ceremonial occasions, but in every moment of daily life. The way she entered a room, the way she sat beside Nero, the way she reacted to others' words, all of it had to evoke Poppaea as Nero had known her, loved her, and obsessed over her. Sabina was not allowed to live by her own memories, but was required to memorize and reenact memories that were not her own. There were stories, small details about Poppaea that Sabina was forced to learn by heart. What she liked, what she disliked, how she reacted in certain situations. Nero would suddenly test her, asking questions without warning. A wrong answer, a slightly mistimed reaction, no matter how minor, could provoke his anger. And Nero's anger at this stage always carried real danger. Living beside someone who no longer clearly distinguished between memory and the present meant existing in a constant state of alert. Each day felt like walking through a minefield. No one said it aloud, but Sabina understood perfectly well. If the illusion Nero clung to were to shatter, the price could be her life. Silence, therefore, became a means of survival. Speaking less, reacting more slowly, minimizing anything that might be perceived as different. Gradually, that silence ceased to be a choice and became a permanent condition. Sabina spoke little, showed little emotion. Her face almost always settled into an expression of weary composure. Within the lavish palace, surrounded by rituals and servants, Sabina lived like a shadow. Her presence was visible, but the person inside was not. Sabina's mental state deteriorated in a quiet, drawn-out way. There was no dramatic breakdown, no cries for help, no open rebellion. Instead, there was a slow erosion. Each day began with waking up in an identity that was not her own. Each day required calling herself by a Chush-e name. Each day demanded performing another person's role in front of someone who held the power of life and death over her. What was most cruel was that Sabina had no space to return to being herself, not even in her own thoughts. When someone is forced to perform for too long, the boundary between the role and the self begins to blur. Perhaps even Sabina no longer knew who she was, or whether she still was anyone at all. Sporus had been erased from the outside world, and at the same time pushed out of the mind of the person who once carried that name. In the eyes of the court, Sabina was a strange empress no one dared to discuss. In Nero's eyes, Sabina was compensation, proof that he could triumph even over death. And within Sabina herself, there remained only emptiness and exhaustion. A life wrapped in power and gold, yet lacking the most basic thing of all, the right to exist as a human being with an identity, memories, and personal limits. And so, day after day, the false empress continued to live inside a play with no true audience, where every step had to fit the role, every breath had to align with someone else's illusion, and every small deviation could become the end. But no performance built on power lasts forever. While Nero remained absorbed in the distorted world he had created for himself, the Roman Empire beyond the palace walls was slowly descending into chaos. Provinces rebelled, generals turned away, and loyalties, always fragile, began to collapse rapidly. What fear and divine authority had once concealed now became clear. Nero no longer controlled the empire, and no longer even controlled himself. News of uprisings reached Rome day after day. Governors declared they no longer recognized Nero. The army, the backbone of imperial power, began to shift its allegiance. Even the Praetorian Guard, who had sworn to protect him to the end, withdrew their support. The isolation Nero had once imposed on others now turned inward and closed around him. At last, the Senate made a decision that had once seemed unthinkable. They declared Nero an enemy of the state. For a Roman emperor, this was effectively a death sentence. Nero fled the palace, wandering among suburban villas with only a handful of remaining companions. There were no rituals, no cheering crowds, no absolute power that had once forced the entire empire to bow. In those final days, Nero wavered between delusion and despair. At times he still spoke of returning, of unfinished artistic performances, of a greatness history had failed to understand. But these moments were followed by overwhelming terror, fear of capture, of public humiliation, of being treated the way he himself had once treated others. In the year 68 AD, when he realized there was no escape, Nero chose death. He took his own life, ending a reign marked by violence, chaos, and wounds that could never fully heal. For history, this was the end of an emperor. But for Sporus, it was only the beginning of another tragedy. With Nero's death, Sporus lost the only thing that had ever protected him, even if that protection was cruel and deeply distorted. Sporus's entire status as empress existed solely through Nero's will. When that will disappeared, Sporus became no one. No title, no authority, no one left to shield him. Only a broken human being standing alone in a world filled with hatred for everything connected to Nero. In the eyes of the victors, Sporus was not a victim. He was a remnant of a shameful era, a living symbol of the decadence they wanted erased. No one cared what Sporus had endured. No one asked how he had been changed, what had been taken from him. All they saw was a freak, inseparable from the name of a tyrant. From the moment Nero fell, Sporus was cast out of the fragile safety he had never chosen for himself. There was no palace, no ritual, no role protected by fear. Sporus entered the most dangerous phase of his life, surviving in an empire bent on avenging its past, where every trace of Nero could be crushed without mercy. The tragedy did not end with the tyrant's death. For Sporus, Nero's collapse did not mean liberation, but the complete destruction of the last remaining support. A person stripped of identity was now stripped even of protection, left to be carried away by the shifting tides of power. After Nero's death, Sporus was not freed, as one might assume. On the contrary, he was thrust directly into another hell, colder and more exposed, where there was no longer the veneer of pathological love or the false shelter of imperial ceremony. If Sporus had once been imprisoned within one man's illusion, he now became an object fought over by many who were hungry for power. The Roman Empire at that time descended into unprecedented turmoil. Emperors rose and fell in rapid succession. And within that vortex, Sporus was passed along like a grotesque trophy. One man claimed him to assert authority, another kept him as a living symbol that he had inherited or even conquered, Nero's legacy. No one saw Sporus as a human being. They saw him as property, something that could carry political meaning or serve as entertainment, depending on the moment. Each time he was transferred to a new powerful figure, Sporus had to learn how to survive a different kind of fear. There was no familiar palace, no stable role to cling to. Each new master brought different obsessions, desires, and cruelties. Some continued to force him to live as Papilla, calling him by the old name, making him wear the Empress's dresses as if the past had never ended. Others treated him as a strange curiosity, equal parts fascinated and contemptuous. What was most terrifying was this: Sporus no longer had value because of a distorted form of love, but because of his ability to shock. His existence became a way for others to display absolute power, to prove they could do anything to anyone. He was a living remnant of a cursed reign, and a tool for successors to trample that past in full view of the world. With each instance of exploitation, the human part of Sporus seemed to wear away a little more. There was no hope left, no lingering illusion that escape was still possible. What had once been the title of Empress now only made him an object of mockery and scrutiny. The world around him did not need to know what he had endured. They saw only a strange figure, convenient for amusement or for asserting power. The lowest point of this descent came when one of those in power decided that Sporus would be used as entertainment in the arena, not as a human being, but as a living prop in a violent and humiliating reenactment of myth. Before thousands of staring eyes, Sporus would be turned into an object of ridicule, a source of cruel pleasure for a crowd hungry for blood and degradation. For Sporus, this was no longer simple fear. It was the final boundary. If before he had been forced to live as someone else, now he was being pushed toward total destruction in front of the public. There would be no privacy left, no dignity remaining. In that scenario, death no longer seemed like the worst outcome. The painful truth was this: Sporus had been treated like an object for so long that society no longer recognized his right to refuse. The plan to send him into the arena was discussed as if it were the preparation of a performance, not the fate of a human being. No one asked whether he could endure anymore. No one questioned whether this had gone beyond every possible limit. In this final hell, Sporus came face to face with the rawest reality of power. When a person is stripped of identity, body, and voice, they can be used until there is nothing left to take. And it was precisely at that moment, when every external path was closed, that Sporus stood before the one choice no emperor could make on his behalf. When the prospect of being dragged into the arena became unmistakably real, Sporus understood that he had reached the absolute end. There were no illusions left to cling to, no one left to hope might protect him, and no role left that could shield him from the humiliation that awaited. For the first time in many years, Sporus saw the road ahead with complete clarity. If he continued to live, he would exist only as a body used for the entertainment of others. Throughout his short life, Sporus had almost never been allowed to choose. From the moment he was noticed for his resemblance to Papilla, through the forced surgery, the renaming, the marriage, and the passing from one owner to another like an object, every decision had been imposed by others. He existed, but he had never lived on his own terms. And so, when faced with the certainty of public degradation before thousands, Sporus made the only decision that no one could take away from him. In the year 69 AD, Sporus ended his own life, most likely by poison. Such a death was not uncommon in ancient Rome. But for Sporus, it was not simply death. It was a conscious act, a clear refusal of the role that society and power had imposed upon him. Better to end everything in silence than to be dragged into the light as a living spectacle. Sporus's death took place without ceremony, without witnesses, without farewells. It was quiet, much like most of his true life, which had always been hidden behind imposed titles and borrowed forms. Yet it was precisely in that silence that, for the first time, Sporus did not have to play anyone else. Not Papilla, not Sabina, not a symbol of imperial decay, just a human being choosing to stop. That is where the meaning of this act lies. Sporus could not reclaim the years that were taken from him, nor restore the body or identity that had been destroyed. But by choosing death rather than continued humiliation, he reclaimed the right to decide his own fate, even if only in the final moment, a right he had been denied his entire life. Sporus was likely no more than 20 years old, an age at which, for many, life is only beginning. For him, it was the end, after too much pain and too many layers of oppression piled one upon another. His youth was consumed by the power of others, and death became the only way out of that spiral. No one knows exactly what Sporus thought in his final hours, but it is possible to imagine that, In that moment, he no longer had to carry memories that were not his own, no longer had to perform a flawless role, no longer had to fear a glance or a misplaced word. There was only one simple decision left, one that neither the court, nor emperors, nor crowds could interfere with. And it is there, in that tragic ending, that Sporus ceased to be only a victim guided entirely by others. Even at the cost of his life, that act marked a rare moment in which he was free, in the deepest and most painful sense of the word. When we look back on this entire story, what matters most may be how we choose to remember Sporus. In many ancient accounts, he is mentioned as a symbol of decadence, a shocking detail used to underline the corruption of a dying regime. But if we stop there, history unintentionally repeats what Sporus himself endured, stripping away the human being behind a label designed to provoke curiosity. Sporus was not an embodiment of depravity. He did not choose to become an empress, did not choose surgery, did not choose to be turned into a tool for someone else's obsession. He was the victim of a form of absolute power in which the will of one person could crush the body, identity, and fate of another without encountering any barrier. Sporus's tragedy does not lie in his appearance or in the bizarre rituals imposed upon him, but in the fact that he was denied the right to be himself. Perhaps the most painful aspect of this entire story is the erasure of identity. Sporus was not only controlled in behavior and body, but forced to live as someone else, to carry another person's memories, to be called by another person's name. When a human being is no longer allowed to exist with a personal identity, they cease to be an individual and become merely a vessel for the will of the powerful. This is a form of violence that is subtle yet brutal, leaving wounds that cannot be seen. From a historical perspective, the story of Sporus reminds us that behind monuments, palaces, and grand titles lie small lives that were crushed. The splendor of the Roman Empire was built not only on victories and power, but also on unnamed personal suffering, on people who were never properly remembered. When history focuses only on rulers, victims like Sporus are easily reduced to footnotes at the margins. The greatest value this story leaves behind does not lie in its shock or sensationalism, but in compassion. Seeing Sporus as a human being allows us to understand that human rights are not a modern luxury, but a fundamental need that has been violated for thousands of years. The right to live in one's own body, under one's own name, with one's own choices. When these rights are taken away, whether in the name of love, art, or power, the outcome is always tragedy. This story also serves as a quiet yet profound warning about the corruption of power. When power is left unchecked, it does not merely erode the morality of those who hold it. It turns others into means, into objects, into stages for personal obsessions. Nero did not only destroy Sporus, he also destroyed his own ability to distinguish right from wrong, dragging countless other lives into the fallout. And perhaps what makes the story of Sporus continue to haunt us today is that it forces us to ask ourselves a difficult question. Within glittering societies and seemingly solid systems of power, how many people are still having their identities erased without being seen? Remembering Sporus is not about judging the past, but about reminding ourselves that history only truly matters when it helps people in the present live with greater humanity, remain vigilant in the face of power, and learn to value the dignity of every individual, no matter how small or invisible they may be.